Good to be here. So we're going to, and we have already heard quite a lot about the sharing economy, which, as many of you may know, there's also a big debate in the business community about whether it's really a sharing economy, a peer-to-peer economy, collaborative economy, on-demand economy, whatever the title is. And I think increasingly we're understanding sort of why it's happening. But I want to focus on sort of what this might mean in terms of our daily lives. I work at the Metropolitan Design Center here at the University of Minnesota, and I'm less engaged with the technology itself and much more involved in sort of the impact that this technology is going to have on our streets, on our public realm, on our daily lives. And so that's what I wanted to focus on here. I think that you know, a lot of scholars have really made a lot of observations about the kind of technological drivers of this new economy. You know, and as one group of scholars talks about, it's the development of information technologies along with the growth of Web 2.0, which has developed this online platforms that promote user-generated content sharing and collaboration, a peer-to-peer based activity of obtaining, giving, and sharing access to goods and services. The way our economics colleagues talk about this is disintermediation, the idea that we are in an economy that is rapidly eliminating intermediaries out of our economy. And I think, of course, that's part of the disruption here, which is that we have built up an economy in the 20th century which had a lot of intermediaries involved in supply chains and in the disaggregation of various kinds of industries. And the taking out of intermediaries is itself a huge economic shift. There's also been a lot of conversation about the motivations, a lot of work done as to why people are engaged in the sharing economy. As this chart suggests, everything from convenience and pricing, quality, a lot of interest in social interactions, a desire to have interactions with a community of peers, saving time and as well as money, and actually sustainability is also a topic that comes up more frequently than you might expect. And I think part of this, and certainly the conversations we'll be having in this symposium about autonomous vehicles, so much of this economy is being driven by technology which is frequently faster, cheaper, safer, and cleaner. And so it becomes difficult for an old economy, a carbon-based, siloed, competitively oriented economy to compete when you can provide those kinds of options. But what I want to actually focus on is maybe a more fundamental question, which is why this is so appealing, seemingly, to so many people. Of course, it also scares a lot of people, those who have done very well in the old economy. But I want to make the argument here that the sharing economy resonates in ways that are very deeply embedded in all of us. When you think that we as a species spend at least 90% of our history in small tribal groups, sharing food and shelter, collaborating on child rearing and chores, receiving information as soon as everybody else in our tribe had it, we largely evolved in sharing economies. And this really began to change about 12,000 years ago with the emergence of the agricultural economy, and with it permanent shelters, the rise of cities, the division of labor, expansion of the human population, all the things that we are now familiar with, to the point where, as some scientists now say, we've become the ultimate invasive species. But one of the ways that the environmental historian likes to think about this is if you imagine our history as a species as being a 24-hour day, agriculture and permanent settlements would be the last 6 minutes before midnight, and the modern post-Gutenberg world is the last 15 seconds before midnight. And so the point here is that we tend to think of this world that we all occupy as somehow normal and as just inherently the way to live, when in fact, as a species, this is an incredibly small period of time in our history. And so I want to make the argument that the sharing economy resonates with us for very deep fundamental reasons that may be in part subconscious. Now, Jared Diamond has gone on to further to call the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago as the worst mistake in the history of the human race. It's interesting, a lot of the research that has been done by cultural anthropologists and anthropology generally has discovered that we are only now getting back to the average lifespan of hunters and gatherers. So when we in fact started to live in cities, started our industrial practices, it led to dramatic drops in health and longevity. And so while, Diamond goes on to say that this was our worst mistake because of the inequalities, disease, and despotism that really came in the wake of agriculture, I think most of us now recognize that the global civilization that we've created is environmentally unsustainable, economically unjust in many ways, and socially unstable. So part of the argument here is that the sharing economy offers one way out of this quandary, that through collaborative activities, through collaborative consumption that connects us globally and ever more closely as a species, this is really a reinvention of capitalism to what the venture capital group Index Ventures calls the rise of the village economy. So that's another way that I think we might want to think about the sharing economy. It's actually a return to a kind of village economy, a kind of high-tech version of the economies in which we evolved, which is, again, I think what makes it so powerful, in some ways an almost irresistible economic idea. This, of course, does not mean we're all going to go return to living in grass huts and hunting and gathering for our food. But I do think it's an argument that says that many of the forces that have led to the environmental degradation, the economic injustice, and the social, and as we now know, the political polarization that has really emerged in our midst, is that these phenomena are going to find themselves challenged and maybe eventually overturned by forces that resonate with how humans have organized ourselves for most of our history. And part of the interesting way in which our political science colleagues are looking at the political polarization that we are now watching is the fact that we are inheritors of the nation state as an idea, when in fact we may be a series of tribes that look at each other in a kind of with incomprehension. We can't imagine. There are groups, obviously, that can't imagine anybody voting for Donald Trump, just as there are probably people that can't imagine anybody voting for Hillary Clinton or whoever. You name your person. And to me, what this sort of reflects is the idea that we are increasingly tribal in the way in which we identify ourselves and think about ourselves. And it also does raise questions about the role of a global economy and this village economy in terms of national economies, in terms of the nation state. And so it's kind of the rise of the use of the Marshall McLuhan idea, the rise of a global village or global villages as a kind of new way to think about how we may organize ourselves. Behind this economy lies, I think, another McLuhan idea, which is the notion that the media is the message. He argued, as many of you no doubt know, that changes in media, how we get and communicate ideas and information, fuels changes in culture. And we now know from many historical studies the impact of the printed book on Western culture, the idea of making ideas and information widely available to an increasingly literate audience led to many of the cultural changes that we are the beneficiaries of, from the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, the scientific revolution in the 17th, the democratic revolutions of the 18th, and the industrial revolution of the 19th century. And so that shift in media has a profound effect. Now, there are others, of course, Ivan Illich in his book, The ABC of Literacy, who argue that just as we fell into literacy, we are in a moment where we are falling out of literacy, that we are moving increasingly into a visual culture and getting information in ways that isn't necessarily via the book. And in part driven by technology, mobile digital technology, such as devices like this. You know, one of the things that certainly a statistic that suggested for me the power of this change in media is that these smartphones that no doubt many of us have in our pockets right now have 25 times the computing power of all the computers on Earth in 1995. So we have put that much power in the hands of every individual, giving us access to ideas and information at a speed and at a scale never before possible. It literally achieves a very ancient human idea of having the whole world in your hands. And the ability not just to download information, but to download entire academic libraries anywhere that you have a good internet connection. I mean, these kinds of shifts in media cannot help but have a profound cultural change. And no doubt will have the kind of impact that Gutenberg's invention had, but I think at this time at a hyper speed, given the capabilities of this technology. Now, I think the paradox here is that this high-tech innovation may allow us to return to an existence, as I said, akin to what we evolved in which we had instant access to all that we needed and wanted to know. I think it's enabled us to become sort of digital hunters and gatherers. It's enabled us to become producers as well as consumers, to live globally and locally simultaneously. And as I want to make the case that this is not a new idea, this is a profoundly old idea, one that we spent most of our history living in. So with this economy, I think comes a return to ways of living and working not seen in a very long time. As increasing numbers of people in the economy are interested in access rather than ownership, are more oriented toward collaboration rather than competition. And with this, for example, comes other larger shifts in the way we view the world around us. I mean, there have been there's been this kind of interesting shift in even how we view the natural world. We tended to view it in Darwinian terms, in terms of the way Herbert Spencer and others talked about the sort of survival of the fittest, that the natural world was a world of competition and for scarce items, scarce resources. And increasingly the conversation is now about the natural world as a collaborative, cooperative set of ecosystems in which there's actually abundance. And so the metaphor for nature itself is beginning to change along with this economy. And so this is an economy oriented toward collaboration more than competition, with people inclined to live closer together rather than farther apart. And that too, I think, is an issue that is worth talking about, because in some ways, as we all know, this technology really would allow us to live and work anywhere. And so why people are actually choosing to live in cities is, I think, certainly a sort of surprising aspect of this. But I think there's no question that it's happening. It's sort of the interest in artisanal crafts rather than mass-produced commodities, a desire for meaningful experience and a willingness to pay for experiences and, rather than kind of forgettable commodity-like environments. An interest, certainly we see this at universities among our students, a desire for purposeful work rather than meaningless jobs. And as well, among particularly younger people, a concern for issues like equity and sustainability rather than amassing possessions. And in fact, the very idea of amassing possessions gets to be, in an access-oriented economy, something that people are increasingly skeptical about. And we see this, the implications of this, the rise of micro-housing units, where the development of much smaller living spaces, when in fact your value system isn't about owning lots of things, I think are all indicative of the shift that is happening. Now, those who are still immersed in the old mass production and mass consumption economy find these ideas maybe a little disturbing. I gave recently a talk to Chamber of Commerce, and you know, it's interesting. I find the Q&A sections of these talks fascinating, because I find that it is not entirely generational, but there are, you know, a good number of people in the audience who are excited about the possibilities and opportunities of this economy, and some who often will label it as impractical, utopian, unattainable, or at best something far off in the future. And I think that as though the data shows on this, that the sharing economy is not something far off in the future. It's actually happening here now, and it's happening quite quickly. There's been a lot of analysis by everyone from Morgan Stanley to Deloitte to PricewaterhouseCoopers. They wrote in a report last year that the 5 main sharing economy sectors generated $15 billion in global revenues, which is just 5% of total revenue in the 10 sectors that they were looking at. However, they say that by 2025, they expect these same 5 sharing economy sectors to generate over half of all the overall sales in those 10 sectors, a growth to $335 billion within about a 10-year period. And so the speed with which this economy is emerging, is really remarkable, and I think something that is hardly utopian and far off in the future. So what does this mean in terms of how our lives may change? As I said, we're living closer together. One of the other phenomenon that we're living through is the fastest urbanization of the human species ever in our history. It took our species up to the early 21st century to become 50% urbanized. And yet the United Nations expects that to increase to 66% by 2050, which was more than double what it was just a century before. So if we were to plot this, is this a dramatic hockey stick-like curve that we are experiencing? Why this is happening is, there are lots of thoughts about it. I argued in a TED Talk last year that in some ways, I think the rapid urbanization of the human species, which is happening, is not being driven just by economics, but it also is a reflection of the environmental predicament that we are in, because we are, I think, doing in some sense what every species does when it's faced with damage to the ecosystems that they depend on. Species that are threatened in this way do not disperse, they actually concentrate in the few ecosystems that can continue to support them. So the argument here being that cities are an ecosystem that humans can thrive within, and so we are moving into cities as we create instability elsewhere in the environment. But I think there's also no question that, apart from that environmental argument, that the rise of cities are really a result of this economic shift, as we've seen rural economies hollow out with the industrialization of agriculture, and as urban economies have grown, now representing 80% of all total global GDP. So as our population urbanizes and as urban densities increase, I think people are also going to start to move around in ways strikingly different from the past. The auto-centric suburban settlement patterns of the last century, I think were actually quite reasonable in terms of a response to a mass production and mass consumption economy. We created a situation where we were able to overproduce goods to such an extent that creating a settlement pattern that required everyone to buy a car, buy a lawnmower, buy a dishwasher, buy virtually everything that we needed to run this kind of dispersed settlement pattern was needed to absorb the overproduction of consumer goods coming off of assembly lines. But I think what's significant about the sharing economy is how much it moves in the opposite direction. As some scholars have said, for the first time in 50 years, we've seen a steady 2.5% decline in miles driven per year over the last 8 years, leading to what my colleague David Levinson here and his co-author Kevin Kreisig call the end of traffic. And so we're seeing an economy in which people are living closer together and closer to where they work, closer to mass transit options, bike-friendly streets, more people working at home, some or all of the week. All of this represents a major shift in when and how we will move about. And so part of the conversation about autonomous vehicles, for example, is not just the impact they're going to have on congestion in terms of the number of people who may be moving around, but also how does the sharing economy simply change commuting patterns or the very idea of needing to commute at all. At the same time, the sharing economy, I think, will continue to wring out the excess production and overcapacity of what we inherited from the 20th century mass production economy. You know, ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft recognize that there are simply too many seats in cars being driven around that are empty. And the idea that the availability of seats offered car owners and the platform providers a money-making opportunity. This idea, a very old idea, that we are not simply consumers, we're also producers, that we're not just buying, we're also selling, and that our overcapacity world has so many of these opportunities. We know from the ride-sharing phenomenon that this has created tensions with taxi drivers and others who make a living driving others around. But again, it's very difficult to compete with a sharing economy's ability to offer services more conveniently, more memorably at a lower cost. Some have even gone on to say that we are in an economy that will see the Uberization of all things, in which new businesses will arise in virtually every sector of the economy to unlock the hidden wealth of underutilized assets or resources. By the end of 2013, for example, excess capacity businesses had reached $2 billion, representing what one analyst called a massive paradigm shift in how we live, work, play, travel, create, bank, and consume. And so whether it's from Airbnb's utilization of spare rooms or living units, to Buy My Wardrobe's use of underutilized clothing in our closets, to Parking Panda's location of unoccupied parking spaces, to food sharing's offering of excess food to those in need, the sharing economy has made the elimination of waste and the absorption of excess capacity one of the great growth opportunities in the current economy. And this is really, as we all know, has really begun to disrupt the retail sector of our economy. Shopping malls, for example, are closing at an average rate of 10% a year, even as urban experiential retailing continues to grow. So it's not as if people aren't buying things in bricks and mortar locations, but they're buying in a very different way. And again, this idea of paying for experience rather than necessarily for goods. Meanwhile, analysts continue to expect e-commerce to increase by 40%, and by 2018 to be at $414 billion. Another bit of research I thought was interesting is 40% of men and 33% of women aged 18 to 34 said that they would ideally buy everything online if they could. And so we're seeing this generational shift as well, which suggests that bricks and mortar stores need to focus on memorable experiences, personal service, and hard-to-find online goods, and that big box suburban retail may be a disappearing breed unless they can adapt. Had a conversation with colleagues around a Macy's store in downtown Minneapolis whose upper floors are empty, and the idea of what's the future of a company like Macy's whose bottom line has been struggling. Some of you may have seen the report a week or two ago about how big a drop they've taken in their profits. So this idea that we are now at a point where you can mass customize apparel so that it not only fits you precisely, but would be made upstairs at the same price that it costs to mass produce an article of clothing and ship it from China. So the idea being that you would basically go to a Macy's, have mass customized clothing, and that you would also get to know the person who was making your clothing because they were in the same building producing it. And so these are models, new ways to think about how bricks and mortar retailing can begin to adapt to this collaborative on-demand economy. And a lot of this then is going to be based on local production. The economist Jeremy Rifkin has argued we've entered an economy in which we will see what he calls the end of work, by which he meant the end of the kind of routine and, as he said, pointless work that dominated much of the 19th and 20th century in mass production, and the rise of what he calls a zero marginal cost society that sees us leading to a lifestyle in which everything is connected with every being, the Internet of Things, which will allow, as he says, our species to empathize and socialize as a single extended human family. Again, the kind of global village idea. This also pretends, as Rifkin and others have talked about, the rise of a third industrial revolution in which we will see this move from mass production to mass customization in the economy as digital tools enable us to craft custom goods and services at rates and at costs comparable to making and shipping mass-produced items, which again suggests that bricks and mortar retail may in some ways look like high-tech versions of pre-industrial handicrafts as much as anything else, in which we will in fact, as in a village economy, know the people who are making the goods that we use, and also that we are co-creators with those who are making the goods and offering the services that we use. This is also, I think, going to have a huge effect on how we communicate and learn. Just as the printed book and Gutenberg's invention led to the flourishing of intellectual life and the growth of education, both primary, secondary, and higher education, I think there's no question, certainly for those of us working in universities, how the internet-connected mobile technology is altering this connection between student and teacher, between school and community, between knowledge and innovation. I think we're going to see, and are already starting to see in universities, a shift to more co-creation within the classroom, with students teaching as much as teachers learning, this idea of flipping our classrooms. The idea of the school being in the community, a part of the community, as well as the community being a kind of school. With some of my classes, I've been teaching them nomadically. I let my students determine where they actually want to learn. What I find interesting about this, never once do they choose a classroom as a place where they want to learn. They find all kinds of other places in the city to learn, and I find that they actually remember the content better because they associate what we talked about with the place. So the city, the community becomes a kind of memory device, a mnemonic device for learning. And I think we're seeing as well disciplines collaborating in really new and highly unusual combinations in this sharing economy. So again, it's less about disciplines defending turf and more about how many people can you connect to, can build a network with. This, of course, challenges professional hierarchies and power structures, not just in educational institutions, but really across virtually every institution in our economy. And I think the challenge and the interesting phenomenon that we're going to see in the coming decades is how quickly we can overcome people's fears of the new economy and help people see the opportunity and not sort of resist it and put in barriers. I think this, and of course, every economic shift has its downsides as well as its upsides. And I think that that is true, something I know we've talked about already and we'll continue to talk about this afternoon. For example, the autonomous vehicle phenomenon offers certainly a case in point. Truck driving is now the most common job in most states in the United States. And the previous two most common jobs were secretarial work and farming. And we know what technology has done to both farming and to secretarial work. And I think in the next decade or so, we're going to discover what technology does to truck driving, which is the likely obsolescence of that as long distance, particularly long distance trucking, becomes one of the first industries to embrace autonomous vehicles. So I think that we can anticipate similar dislocations in one industry after another. What will happen to hotel workers now that Airbnb has become the world's largest hotelier? What will happen to taxi drivers facing competition from Uber and Lyft? What will happen to retail workers undermined by online shopping? And I think one of the challenges we face is to not let the forces of anti-disintermediation place so many barriers in the way of what I guess I would argue is in some ways a kind of inevitable economic change. I think this is an issue that we can learn from the Luddites of the 19th century who tried to destroy the machines that were threatening handicraft jobs. But as we now know, those were Pyrrhic victories at best. They were short-term interruptions in an economy that did in the 19th century certainly disrupt people's lives and livelihoods, and we will see that happening again, for better or worse. It will not only disrupt individuals' lives, family lives, but it will also, and we'll talk about this afternoon, interrupt some of the revenue streams of municipalities, as well as overturn and challenge some of the public policies we have built around the old economy. I think that, part of this as well is how do we bring the public sector along so that it becomes an agent for change and facilitating the opportunities and the retraining that is going to have to happen for some in this economy, rather than setting up barriers and resisting those kinds of, resisting this sharing economy by putting up barriers. So I think the paradox here is that the sharing economy, which is a decidedly capitalistic economy, actually seems likely to take us to a place that the Luddites would have liked, which is to revive a kind of digital high-tech version of handicraft. It also is paradoxically an economy that Marx might have admired, because it puts the means of production, digital tools, in the hands of ordinary people. So in some ways, the sharing economy takes us back as it takes us forward, using some of the most advanced technology ever imagined to return us to a village economy that we all know all too well. And resisting this change, I think, also leads to the ironic result of holding on to an old economy that, as Rifkin and others say, is at its end game, is unsustainable and inequitable. And I think we need to see the sharing economy for what it is, part of a many thousand-year cycle in which we left a sharing economy in order to overcome its limitations, and now we are in a place where we can return to it with new understanding and appreciation, cognizant of what we've learned in the meantime, and knowing what we now leave behind. So, thank you.
We do have time for a question or two.
Yeah? No takers? I'll be around all afternoon if you want to ask me in person or throw tomatoes at me or whatever you want to do. Yeah, good.
Anthony Sanders, Institute for Justice. With all this change of the virtual landscape and the economic landscape, at the same time, the literal landscape, how we have our towns and cities laid out, is still very much this 20th century Euclidean zoning, where there's a hard line between work and home, and home-based businesses are discouraged. How do you see that playing out when most of how that is planned is still in the hands of city councils and places that are not maybe willing to go along with this rapid change? Yeah,
I mean, that's one of the key questions. There's not an easy answer. It's going to be a evolutionary process. I mean, I think that a lot of the conversations we have in the kind of urban design planning world is how do we create public policies that allow for much greater flexibility, that are not so black and white, public-private, the way in which we've disaggregated our cities with residential districts in one place and commercial in another and industrial in another, taking apart the city and expecting people to commute among them, and increasingly seeing that the kind of work that's going on in this new economy is often happening in the same place or very close to each other. But getting zoning policies kind of out of the way, again, this is going to be one of our challenges, is how do we bring the public sector and city council members and others along. I find in my planning colleagues, most of them get this. I find actually mayors get this too. Many of them say, it's the city councils, their chambers are some of the greatest obstacles to this. And so it is about public education and, again, helping people overcome fear to seeing what's, the opportunity here. But it's a great question.
Hi, I'm Kyle Samajima, undergrad student at the University in Environmental Communication, and I'm wondering how you see the sharing economy fitting in with the move away from a linear economy to a circular economy.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, there's a strong kind of environmental component to this economy. I didn't talk a lot about that, but there's no question that part of this economy, as I said, is squeezing out the incredible waste and the waste stream that the 20th century economy created, the carbon economy created. And so seeing this as business and economic opportunities rather than as something that is just an externality that isn't sort of factored into costs. I think is, again, a huge area of opportunity. So, yeah, I mean, you know, we're the only species that creates landfills. We're actually the only species that creates waste that another species can't use, right? So we are in some ways the dumbest of species. We're actually one of the youngest of species, so we're also a bit like babies. We cry. We expect all the other species to serve our needs, you know? So we have to grow up, and we have to get a lot smarter. Yeah.
The question, you know, you mentioned Marx, but, you know, I'm concerned that, you know, when you compare the sharing economy, but because of the big data, very few people who control the data. So they are the ones who are getting the most of the profit, not the individuals.
Controlling the data or the platforms?
The platforms and the data. Okay. All of them are being controlled by the few, and they are the ones who are getting most of the benefits. So that's the biggest issue for our society, that how we're going to break that, how we're going to deal with that particular issue.
Yeah, I mean, every industrial revolution goes through this early phase where a few people benefit enormously from it. I mean, think about the last industrial revolution of the early 20th century, Ford and Rockefeller. I mean, there were few people amassed enormous fortunes, and we developed public policies that worked against that. And we were going to have to do the same with this third industrial revolution, because you're right, there are the Bill Gateses of the world that, you know, there are people who are amassing huge fortunes and basically developing utilities. I mean, Facebook's become a utility. And so, you know, maybe we should start to treat it like it is. You know, Google is a utility. And so I think we're going to start to see the law and public policy follow. But you know, there's no question, we're in that early industrial revolution phase again, where there's a lot of inequity in that regard.
Yes, hi. My name is Philippa Fesch at the University of Toronto. A related question. At the beginning of your talk, you said that disintermediation would be a phenomenon. But it seems to me that jury is still out, right? Because it's far from clear. Once there is sharing, that means you need to coordinate usage. Yeah. And it's not clear to me why that can just be done in a peer-to-peer fashion. And if we just look at Uber and others, there's actually new intermediaries. Yeah, and I think that, I mean, you know, this is instead of the anti-disintermediation, this is the re-intermediation of parts of the economy. And that may in fact be true, but I think there's no question that the way in which this economy increasingly seems to be working is building networks and connections that do not allow intermediaries to control the process in the way that they did in the older economy. So there will be, you know, as this economy matures, I think there's no doubt that you're going to start to see new kinds of, people who bring together information, provide new value. You know, I spent part of my career as an editor, and editors are intermediaries, and what we did is we got rid of a lot of stuff that wasn't very interesting to our readers, and we aggregated the rest, and that was of value. So we're going to we already see aggregators in this new economy. But they're less about controlling processes than they are providing value that other people come to. But, yeah. And curators is another, yeah. I actually think, in fact, we're talking about that here at this university. I'm chairing with a committee called the Serendipity Committee. It's a funny name, but it's recognizing that actually most new ideas happen serendipitously when you get faculty and students interacting across disciplines. And this idea of a kind of curatorial role for people who have a connector role within a network and a system are going to be increasingly valuable. So they are a kind of intermediary, but a different kind than I think what the old economy produced. It's a great question, though. So thank you for listening.